Britain is on the brink of a massive military gamble, a move that could either assert its power on the global stage or drag it into a perilous conflict. The UK is preparing to send Typhoon fighter jets to patrol the skies over Ukraine in what is being described as an air policing operation. On the surface, it sounds like a defensive measure, a way to ensure that Russian aggression is kept in check. But beneath the headlines, the reality is far more explosive. This announcement comes just as Russia has drawn a hard red line, declaring that NATO troops, under any flag, will not be accepted inside Ukraine. Russia's Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, has made it clear the Kremlin will not tolerate foreign forces, whether they are wearing EU insignias or coming in under the guise of peacekeepers. The message is simple: stay out or face the consequences. Yet, Britain's plan is already raising serious questions. Fighter jets in Ukrainian airspace mean direct military involvement. An air policing operation is not just a surveillance mission. It means British pilots will be on high alert, ready to intercept Russian warplanes if necessary. And with that, the risk of escalation grows dramatically. If a Russian jet is engaged, if a confrontation takes place, there will be no turning back. The situation is becoming even more tense following a major diplomatic slap in the face for Europe. While the world watches the conflict unfold, high-level peace talks took place in Riyadh between Russia and the United States. The shocking part, not a single European leader was invited to the table. For all the grand speeches about European unity, for all the posturing by leaders like Germany's Olaf Scholz and France's Emmanuel Macron, the harsh truth is clear. When it comes to serious negotiations, Europe doesn't matter. This reality was painfully evident when US Secretary of State Marco Rubio tried to downplay the snub, insisting that Europe wasn't being sidelined, but actions speak louder than words. America and Russia sat down without them, discussing the endgame for Ukraine, while Europe was left out in the cold. And then, as if to twist the knife even deeper, Joe Biden has completely thrown Ukraine's president, Volodymyr Zelensky, under the bus. In an astonishing statement, Biden openly blamed Zelensky for the war, saying, "You have leadership now that's allowed a war to go on that should have never even happened. Even without the United States, you should have ended it. 3 years, you should have never started it." This is coming from the same US president who promised unwavering support for Ukraine, the same man who funneled billions in aid, supplied weapons, and pledged to stand by Ukraine no matter what. And now he's basically saying, this is your fault. But while Biden is pointing fingers, Keir Starmer is facing his own moment of utter humiliation. The Labour leader, who has spent his entire career grovelling before the European Union, has been given a brutal wake-up call. After years of sucking up to EU bureaucrats, supporting a second referendum, demanding closer ties with Europe, and desperately trying to prove that Britain should still be part of their club, Starmer finally had his chance to show that all his efforts had paid off. He met with German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, ready to pitch his plan for Ukraine, convinced that Britain and Germany could work together. The plan was simple. If Russia is on the offensive, Europe should send troops to reinforce the Ukrainian border. But what did Scholz do? He stormed out. That's right. He didn't even entertain the idea. He dismissed Starmer on the spot and walked out of the room. For Starmer, this is a complete catastrophe. For years, he has done everything in his power to ingratiate himself with European elites. He's gone to Brussels, to Berlin, to The Hague, making it clear that he wants Britain to be a part of Europe's inner circle again. And yet, when it actually matters, when Britain needs European backing, they have completely abandoned him. The message from Germany is clear. They don't respect Starmer. In fact, they don't respect Britain at all. They enjoyed Britain's money when the UK was paying into the EU, but now they see Britain as an outsider, and Starmer, for all his loyalty, is nothing more than an unwanted guest. And while Starmer is being publicly humiliated, Nigel Farage is having the time of his life. In a moment that has gone viral, Farage has once again exposed what he calls the uniparty, the idea that Labour and the Tories are just two sides of the same corrupt establishment. During a political debate, former Tory MP Ranil Jayawardena accidentally referred to Labour Minister Jonathan Reynolds by his personal nickname. The reaction? Farage burst out laughing, because to him, this was proof of what he's been saying for years. The Tories and Labour pretend to be enemies, but behind the scenes, they're all in the same club. Farage's claim? The two major parties collaborate far more than the public realises. They put on a show in Parliament, but behind closed doors, they protect each other, and the people paying the price? Ordinary British citizens. And the concerns about Britain's direction don't stop there. Reform UK's Lee Anderson is warning that Britain is facing an internal crisis. His biggest concern? Uncontrolled borders and rising extremism. According to Anderson, Britain has completely lost control of its immigration system. People are entering the country unchecked, and some are radicalising on British soil. What's worse, when violence erupts, the government picks and chooses who it punishes. When riots broke out in the streets recently, Starmer's government took immediate action, arresting, charging and jailing offenders in record time. but when it comes to dealing with radical extremism, silence. Anderson's argument is simple. If the government can be robust when it wants to be, then why not apply that same toughness to every threat? Why the double standard? And why is the country sitting idly by while these dangers grow? For Anderson, the message is clear. Britain needs leadership that isn't afraid to act. And right now, that leadership does not exist. So here we are, standing at a critical moment. Britain is preparing to send fighter jets into Ukraine, directly challenging Russia's red line. America and Russia are secretly negotiating the war's end without Europe in the room. Starmer's desperate attempts to win EU approval have ended in disaster, with Germany outright rejecting him. Meanwhile, Nigel Farage is exposing the political establishment's fake rivalry, and Lee Anderson is warning that Britain's borders are a ticking time bomb. The big question now is, where does this all lead? Is Britain walking into a military disaster by deploying fighter jets? Will Europe finally realise it has been sidelined? Will Starmer ever recover from this total humiliation? And with Reform UK gaining traction, are we about to witness a massive political upheaval in Britain? One thing is certain, this story is far from over. The next few weeks could change the course of British politics and even global stability. So watch this space, because things are only getting started. The tensions are reaching a boiling point. Britain is on the edge of a military showdown. Europe is collapsing under its own delusions. And Keir Starmer, well, he's been left out in the cold, exposed as a spineless pawn in a geopolitical game he never truly understood. And now, as Britain pushes forward with plans to deploy fighter jets over Ukraine, the question is no longer if this will escalate, but when. Behind the scenes, the pressure is building. Military strategists are weighing the massive risks of this move. Deploying Typhoon jets isn't just about keeping an eye on Russian movements, it's about being ready to engage at a moment's notice. If a Russian jet enters Ukrainian airspace and a British pilot is forced to react, the world will be dragged into an entirely new conflict. And let's not forget, Russia has already made it clear that NATO forces, regardless of the disguise they wear, will not be tolerated. This means that even if Britain tries to label this as a peacekeeping operation, Moscow won't see it that way. And here's where things get even more dangerous. Britain is acting without a unified European front. Germany has pulled back, refusing to commit any troops to Ukraine. France, under Macron, is too busy trying to stay relevant. And the EU as a whole, completely absent from the decision-making table. The real discussions, the ones that will determine the fate of Ukraine, are happening without them. America and Russia held secret talks in Riyadh, discussing what a negotiated end to the war could look like, and yet not a single European leader was present. This is a staggering revelation that exposes just how weak and irrelevant the EU has become in global affairs. They love to lecture nations about democracy, about unity, about standing together, but when the moment comes to actually make a difference, they are nowhere to be found. And no one is more embarrassed by this than Keir Starmer. For years, Starmer has desperately tried to win back the favour of the EU elite. He spent the entire Brexit aftermath campaigning for a second referendum, doing everything in his power to reverse the democratic will of the British people. He grovelled before Brussels, before Berlin, before Paris, all in the hopes that Britain could be welcomed back into the European fold. And how did that work out for him? Total humiliation. He went to Germany, met with Olaf Scholz, and pitched a plan to send European troops to Ukraine. He thought he was presenting a grand vision for European cooperation. He thought he was proving that Britain, under his leadership, was still a key player in European politics. But Scholz's response? He didn't just reject Starmer's plan, he walked out. He didn't even pretend to be interested. He left the room. That's how little respect Europe has for Starmer. That's how little power Britain holds under his leadership. And the worst part? Starmer should have seen this coming. Germany has been a joke when it comes to Ukraine from the very beginning. When the war first started and NATO nations scrambled to send weapons, what did Germany send? A few helmets. That was their big contribution to Ukraine's defence. A handful of helmets. This is the nation Starmer wanted to align himself with. This is the leadership he thought he could rely on. And now, he's been humiliated on the world stage. But while Starmer is licking his wounds, the real opposition is gaining ground. Nigel Farage's viral moment, where he exposed the fake rivalry between the Tories and Labour, has only added fuel to the fire. The more people see just how similar the two parties really are, the more they turn to Reform UK. Farage has been warning about this for years. He's been saying that Labour and the Tories pretend to be enemies in public, but behind closed doors, they are part of the same corrupt system. And now, he has proof. During a live discussion, Tory MP Ranil Jayawardena accidentally called a Labour minister by his personal nickname, exposing the cosy relationship between the so-called rival parties. Farage couldn't contain his laughter because, to him, this was the perfect example of what he's been saying all along. Labour and the Conservatives aren't really fighting for the people, they're fighting to keep power within their own political elite, and it's working. The Tory party is collapsing. Labour is a disaster waiting to happen, and Reform UK, they're rising fast. Meanwhile, Lee Anderson is issuing a stark warning about Britain's future. His biggest concern? The country is under threat from its own weak leadership. He sees it clearly: uncontrolled borders, rising extremism, and a government too scared to act. Anderson has pointed out that when protests turned violent in London recently, Starmer's government acted immediately, arresting and prosecuting people within days. But when it comes to dealing with radical extremism, nothing happens. Why the double standard? Why is the government only tough on certain groups, but completely spineless when it comes to others? Anderson has warned that unless something changes fast, Britain is on a collision course with disaster, and as all of this unfolds, Britain is still preparing to deploy those fighter jets over Ukraine. Russia has drawn a red line. Putin has warned that NATO involvement will not be tolerated. And yet, Britain is still moving forward, still getting ready to take part in a mission that could drag the country into a direct conflict with Russia. If a British jet is shot down, if a Russian aircraft is engaged, if a single miscalculation takes place, the consequences will be catastrophic. So now the question is, what happens next? Will Starmer finally wake up to the reality that Europe has abandoned him? Will Britain's fighter jet deployment trigger a dangerous escalation with Russia? Will Reform UK continue to gain support as the British public wakes up to the political corruption around them? One thing is certain: the next few weeks will be explosive. Stay tuned, because this story is far from over.